Most of us who grew up in rural Africa grew up without access to electricity. I grew up in a small village outside of Matatiele in the Eastern Cape. And in my grandmother's home, I remember we would gather in her kitchen to take up the heat from her wood-fired stove as we would eat isonka sombago, which is baked bread. During these times, the adults would tell stories simply because there was no television. I didn't see anything wrong with my childhood. In fact, I thought these moments brought us closer together as family. There are 600 million Africans that don't have access to electricity. We've all heard this number before. And to most of us, it's just a number. To me, and many other young girls and women who lived in the rural areas or still continue to live there, it means between 4 to 6 hours of their day taken away because they have to find firewood and hike treacherous mountains to do so. It means less time to read, less time to play. For me, it meant a childhood filled with a lot of work. I was fortunate that in the 1990s, my parents were able to move us to another town in the Eastern Cape called Mthatha. And in that town, it felt like I had been teleported to another reality. I know there's not much to say about Mthatha today, but back then, trust me, it was a thing, because I was living in a house that had electricity, that had water. And this meant I had television, so I could watch MacGyver. And it meant I could read. And I was those kids that loved reading, and I was a nerd, and I loved spending my time in the library. And I recall reading a book that had the map of Africa on it. And it had each of the African countries with each thing that country produced, right? So in Nigeria, it had the oil barrels to represent the oil and gas sector. In South Africa, it had the gold nuggets to represent our mining sector, and then in the DRC, it had the diamonds, and so on and so forth. When I looked at this map, I looked at a continent that was wealthy. So it didn't reconcile to me when I would listen to the news and I was constantly being told that I come from a poor continent. It also didn't reconcile to me that I came from a continent that had the raw materials to produce electricity, such as oil and gas and coal, and yet a majority of us were living without access to power. 600 million Africans without access to electricity. When we look at that number today, it's very easy to sort of say it's as a result of mismanagement and corrupt African leadership. But I'd like us to think back a bit. Let's take South Africa. South Africa is well known for the apartheid regime. And often when we think about the apartheid regime, we think about brutal force and violence, and we think about the cruelty to black people who live in this country. But what we often forget about the apartheid regime was the intelligence and strategy that went into the isolation of black people. Infrastructure was used as a tool of exclusion. So you had water and electricity infrastructure specifically built to support white neighborhoods, white businesses. When the ANC came into power in 1994, it effectively inherited an infrastructure system built for the minority, 4.5 million, I think, at the time. It had to use that same infrastructure to supply electricity to a country of about 40.5 million people at the time. This is a fact that's often forgotten, that there simply wasn't enough infrastructure to begin with, nor was there funding. Effectively, the country was starting from scratch. This isn't to say there wasn't mismanagement and corruption along the way, but I think that to reduce the argument about how we got here today is very simplistic. Now, I've been asked to speak on SDG 7. SDG 7 specifically speaks about access to electricity, access to clean, reliable, affordable electricity. Nice words. Right now, let me go back. Access to clean, reliable, affordable electricity by 2030. Let me not forget the year. We're in 2024. 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity. And often when we hear this number again, the blame is shifted back to Africa. Why is Africa so slow in adopting clean energy? Why is Africa so slow in electrifying its villages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Again, let's look at the premise. Africa is being asked to decarbonize at the same rate as the global north. It's not that we don't accept that climate change is a real thing. We've felt its impacts. As the previous speaker said, the unusual weather patterns have an impact of all of us in our domestic lives. But the question we should be asking is, how do we get there, to that decarbonization, to that just energy transition? You need money. Where's the money going to come for us to decarbonize? African leaders have said they need at least $1.3 trillion from the year 2025 in order to be able to decarbonize. Only $100 billion has been committed and not dispersed. So let's think about that. We all know that you can't do much without money. And the ball keeps being kicked back and forth on who is going to hold the responsibility for paying for this just energy transition. Africa is saying, well, we only emit less than 5%. We didn't cause this crisis, and yet we're suffering the most for it. Then let's go to our economies. Whether we like it or not, most of the African economies are supported by hydrocarbon activities, such as mining and oil and gas. 7.1% of the world's natural gas resources are in Africa. 3% of the world's coal resources are in Africa, with South Africa holding the majority. These sectors contribute significantly to our GDPs. So we need to ask, if we simply stop producing, what happens to our economies? Last year, South Africa imported 17 billion rands worth of solar panels. Imported. Imported. Nothing was produced here. That's about 910 million US dollars. Then we need to look at employment. These sectors are large employers in the countries where they're operational. There's always this talk that the renewable energy sector employs a lot of people. I'm in the renewable energy sector, and I can tell you firsthand, during the construction phase, we create thousands of jobs. But we often forget renewable energy is a high-tech industry. It is built to operate optimally with less jobs during operation. So let me give you an example. A 200 megawatt wind farm will create 3,000 jobs during construction. At operation, those jobs dwindle down to between 14 and 24 full-time equivalent jobs. So how do we plug the gap? I know what I've said is a bit heavy, because we know on one hand we need to do something about the climate crisis, but on the other hand, we need to put people at the center. I would like to look at the example of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC currently exports 70% of the world's cobalt. Cobalt is a key component for the manufacture of battery storage in renewable energy, as well as for electrical vehicles. And currently, there's a silent genocide taking place in the DRC because of the conflict created for the demand for these minerals. Now imagine if the DRC was producing these minerals, mining them, beneficiating them, and ensuring that they were being exported for industries in Africa. Imagine if South Africa was actually producing and manufacturing these solar panels instead of importing them. Imagine in 2024, I was not one of the very few females operating as an asset owner in my sector. Imagine if we had Black engineers, African engineers, female engineers operating these plants. You need to create an ecosystem, a value chain to make this thing work. And that requires strategic thinking from our leaders. That requires an investment in research and development. And that requires a strategy. Yes, the just energy transition is here. But I would hate for us to continue in our role as a provider of cheap labor and raw materials. Thank you.